right, so thank you guys for participating in our second panel today, which will be a mystery panel titled Whodunnit? Mystery Authors Confess. Our moderator will be Will Zeilinger. Will, he writes novels that range from 1950s hard-boiled mystery to romance, romantic comedy, and they include The Final, Checkpoint, Something's Cooking at Dove Acres, and The Naked Groom. His short stories that have appeared in Haunted Tales, Stories from Beyond the Grave, Murder USA, and most recently Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and the Unexplainable. He lives in Southern California where he co-writes with his wife, Janet Elizabeth Lynn, and their series are the Skylar Drake Mystery Series and Silvers of Glass, Strange Markings, Desert Ice, and Slick Deal. So helping me welcome Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Can everyone hear in the back? Or do I need to be a little closer? All right, thank you very much. Well, I hope we have a lot of interested mystery readers here. So we're going to introduce the panel. We're going to start at the far end with Jeri Westerson. Jeri is an LA native. She's the author of the Crispin Guest Medieval series, a series nominated for 13 national awards, from the Agatha to the Seamus. For her debut paranormal fantasy series, Book of the Hidden, Romantic Times said, "Book of the Hidden is paranormal romance perfection. Jeri Westerson is flawless in this state of adventure and mystery." Sitting next to her is my wife, Janet Elizabeth Lynn. Janet writes mysteries as well. And since 2001, she's published 7 contemporary, 3 cozies, and 4 1950s hard-boiled detective mysteries with me, Will Zeilinger. She's also written short stories published in Murder USA and Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and the Unexplainable. Janet is currently in the middle of Game Town, the 5th in the Skylar Drake murder series, and it's co-written with me. And yes, we are still married. Sitting next to Janet is Jane Haseldine. Haseldine, correct?
Haseldine.
Haseldine.
No one gets
That's
it
like
right.
Zeilinger. Yeah. All right. Thank you. So she got hooked on people's stories when she discovered an important elementary school survival skill. If you ask someone a question about themselves, it can be a good icebreaker. Early on, she discovered everyone has a story to tell. Wherever she moved, books were in her house. Her mother, a writer, named her Jane Eyre. Is that your middle name?
It is.
All right. And she thought it was actually Jane Eyre, like A-I-R.
For a long time, till I was 8.
She worked at a paper, she went to Syracuse University, where she studied journalism. During her career as a journalist, she discovered the crime beat and also worked as a columnist and editor at newspapers across the country. One great thing about newspapers, you get to work with some of the sharpest, funniest people in the world. At a paper outside of San Jose, she was digging around on a story about alleged corrupt acts made by a police chief. Pardon me a moment. A detective friend of hers, who later would become the inspiration for a recurring character in her books, confirmed the allegations and handed her a document with proof. She rushed back to the paper to write the story. She was furious when her editor decided that she had to work with a political reporter on the piece. But things have a funny way of working themselves out, and the reporter became her husband, and now they have 2 little boys.
A hell of a way to get a story.
You do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Sitting next to Jane is Suzanne Gates. And Suzanne's interest in historical crime fiction began with the family story of her great uncle, a gangster in 1930s Los Angeles. Her novel, The Glamour's Dead, will be released by Kensington Books on Halloween. No, that was last year.
Last year.
Was released. She received her master's degree of fine arts in creative writing at the University of California, Irvine. She lives in Southern California. We have some interesting panelists here. One moment. All right. We're going to start and ask Jeri a question. So you have You have 11 books currently in your Crispin Guest medieval series.
Yep.
How many are left in you?
Well, it's not a matter of what's left in me. It's a matter of how many people are going to buy all of them. There's going to be 15 altogether. I had a whole timeline I wanted to follow, so we're going to end at a certain date. Anybody's familiar with 14th century England, you're going to kind of know that date. So that's a test for all of you here.
Terrific. Now, outside of Crispin Guest, you started a new series, sort of a jump in time.
It's a paranormal romance. So this is the second one that's coming out 3 days from now. Ooh. And it's called Deadly Rising, and it's the Book of the Hidden series. Book with an E at the end. Book of the Hidden series. And it's contemporary, so I there's a lot less research involved. But it's set in Maine, in a small town in Maine, and I like to write about colder places because I live in Southern California, and it doesn't seem to get cold much anymore. So I like to be nice and cool. So it's always set in fall. I like it in the fall, and it's about this young woman who leaves California and moves to Maine, and she's opening an urban tea shop of her own, and she's doing some redecorating and knocks into a wall and discovers this ancient book, and when she opens it, it's like a Pandora's box and releases all these creatures into the world that she has to put back.
Sounds interesting. We're going to have to keep our eyes open. The title again?
The title of the newest book is Deadly Rising, and I have some for sale.
Terrific. Janet.
Wake up.
You write, so we've got 600 years ago, and next we have the 1950s. Why did you decide to write the 1950s, and what kind of a challenge is that for you?
Well, we write 1955.
Could you speak into your mic, please?
1955.
Janet, could you speak into your mic closer?
Can you hear me now? Okay. The reason I chose 1955 is that's my earliest memories of my mother. My mother was a real fashionista of her time, and I'm from New York. So I used to sit on her bed and watch her get ready to go shopping, and of course she had to put on the hat, and I'd watch her hat, and then the hat had to match the belt and the purse and the shoes. And so she always was impeccably dressed, and that was the earliest memories I have of my mother when I was very young. So I decided that's the year I would start, because I remember her getting dressed in the morning.
I've talked to lots of people who write historicals, and they tell me that writing more recent history is far more difficult because you sort of half remember things, and you're never sure when they stopped having phone booths, and
How many of you remember the telephone booths that when you sat down the light went on? How many of you remember elevator operators that had these really cool green uniforms? Okay, this is the era that I write, and I've been really enjoying it, the music, the clothes, the TV shows, because it takes place at that time, and we do quite a bit of research together, and that's a lot of fun as well. So that's why I decided to do 1950s, and I'm thoroughly enjoying the research on that.
Thank you, Janet. Jane, you were a reporter.
Yes, I was.
You were. How did you get from reporter to writing crime novels?
Well, I always knew I wanted to write. You heard the story. My mother named me Jane Eyre, so we always had books, but my mother was a journalist, and she wrote hard news at a time when a lot of women were relegated to writing about on the society page. So I was always equated writing with journalism. And when I was a kid, my mother would always take us to the public library growing up. And when I was 11, I had read all the books in the children's section, and I told my mother I was done with the library. So my mother, being a practical woman, checked out And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, and it was like I discovered electricity. It was the greatest thing ever. So I became a journalist. I loved being a reporter. There's a fellow reporter here also, if you don't know that about her. and I covered the crime beat for a lot of years, and I truly loved it. I left journalism, and I always loved books, but I never really thought about writing them. I knew I would be a terrible teacher, and I thought if I studied English by default, if I couldn't make it as a writer, I'd be an English teacher, and I knew I'd be terrible to my students. I have 2 young children. They're 8 and 13. I volunteer in my second graders class, and if the teacher leaves the room, I am terrified. And I've had to interview a lot of killers in my life. So yeah, I knew I would be a bad teacher. But about 9 years ago, we were living in Michigan where my stories are set. And I thought, you know what, I love books. I'm a writer. I have this idea, and I'm going to write this story. One very bad draft later, and trying to get an agent, which I finally did after many revisions. I got my first book published with Kensington Publishing, and I write a series about a crime reporter who works in the city of Detroit.
Uh-huh.
So that's the Reader's Digest version.
Suzanne. Okay, out of all the genres in all the world, why'd you pick mysteries to write?
I had to walk into that one. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that we had a mystery in my family when I was growing up, and that is the people who lived there in this house. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and the people who lived in the house before had a son who came back from World War II with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was, his room was what later became my bedroom. But what he did was go to the bank, and he took all his money out and buried it in a canning jar in the crawl space underneath our house. And for years, my mom and dad dug for that money. Because it would have made a world of difference to us. And then after they gave that up, my friends and I would go down, and, it became, let's go dig, And so we all go down there, and we get all dirty, and it was lovely fun. But it wasn't until later that the story of, and I guess my compassion was built for the boy who came back from such a horrendous experience, changed. That really hit me. And so I write for that reason. But there was something else that happened that was a little more personal. In the 80s in Oregon, there was a serial killer who killed my best friend's friend. And when that broke in the newspapers, we started asking questions immediately. And one of the questions was, why her and why not us? We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools. What was different? And what we discovered was what was different was drug addiction. And that was where our paths diverged completely. But the other thing, the thing that I couldn't get at was still, why didn't I become a director? Why didn't I? And I kept asking that question. And I think I'm working that out as I write. Because I keep returning to her, and I'll repeat her name in my head, and I'll tell people her name so that they don't forget her and her experience. And I think that when I write, I am sort of paying homage to her in some way.
Good. Jeri, back down to you for a moment. What authors inspired you?
Well, Geoffrey Chaucer is one. I do like some of the older writers from a different time. I'm not as big a fan of Agatha Christie as I am of Dorothy Sayers. She wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey series, and I'm a big fan of characters with backstory and characters who grow throughout the series. And so Dorothy Sayers accomplished that very well in the Lord Peter series, mystery series. You should read them if you've never done that. Of course, when she was writing them, as was Agatha Christie, they weren't writing historicals, they were writing contemporary mysteries. And now for us, they're lovely historicals. But, Shakespeare, I'm a big Shakespeare geek, but to get me into the 14th century, I really, Chaucer is so interesting because in his time, he was writing in English for the first time. Poets were writing in French, and all the great books were in Latin, and the histories and the romances were in French. But this was now English, and the court was speaking English for the first time. And it was Middle English. It would still be difficult for us, the modern folks today, to understand what they were saying, but this was the beginning of the sort of whole feeling of Englishness on the British Isles. So I found that interesting, and it sort of led into this series, Crispin Guest series, because Crispin is a disgraced knight turned detective on the mean streets of 14th century London, and one of his old friends was Geoffrey Chaucer, so of course he had to show up in the series as well. So that's the beginning of all of that stuff.
So we'll jump from the 14th century to the 20th century. And Janet, what author inspired you to write mysteries?
I've always enjoyed hard-boiled 1950s LA. So I love reading Ross MacDonald, Raymond Chandler. Can't get enough of it. I read all of it. And but I always wanted to write hard-boiled. However, I can't get into a guy's head like my husband could. And since he was also a writer, I brought it to him. And I said, what if we wrote this together? And he said, sure, let's try it. Because he has a different version of that conversation. But so then we started writing together, and it is really different, a female head and a male head, and our main character is a male. So there's no way I could have written it without a male. So so I've really been enjoying, again, what's fun is the actual research of doing all these, and we go to places that are 1950s. We went and spent a half a day in LA just looking at the old hotels and it's been so much fun doing it together. Do you want to tell them your version of that statement?
Some of it I didn't catch because of the music.
Okay, when I brought it to you and I wanted to write 1950s, what did you say?
Well,
That's a
1950s was a different time. We were stuck on one small piece. She was writing something, and I read what she wrote, and I said, guys wouldn't say that. Guys don't care what kind of shoes they're wearing. but we did have one scene where we had our detective sitting at a table, and his partner comes in with a beautiful young thing. It's 50, so it's a little sexist. Comes in with a beautiful young thing in his arm, and Janet had written, so Casey Dolan comes in with this young thing in a slinky red dress, and I said, nah. So I said, the way I wrote it was, Casey came in with his beautiful young thing in his arm, and there was a lot going on under that little red dress. So,
who would have thought,
Now,
That's funny.
did you tell about Dean Koontz?
Dinka.
About who inspired you to write?
Yeah, he was the one who gave me the best advice I ever had. I thought I was going to write romantic comedy, but nobody laughed. So I thought they were hysterical, and nobody liked them. So then I thought I'd do romance. Well, I kept killing people, and there's too many dead bodies in here, I mean, that should have been my first clue. So I was very frustrated, and I went to a seminar. Dean Koontz was there. And I went up to him to talk to him. He gave me the best advice. He said, write what you like to read. And for me, that was mystery. So I went home, banged out my first book, which was South of the Pier, contemporary, and people bought it. They liked it. So I did 4. So it was a series of 4, and that's what started it.
Now Jane, yours are contemporary?
Yes.
Yes, in Detroit. And who inspired you to write, besides Jane Eyre?
Yes, and Agatha Christie as a child. He does write some mystery, but my favorite writer is Stephen King. Any Stephen King fans out there? Maybe anyone? The first book I read of his was The Shining, and this was interesting. I think I read it when I was 19 years old, and I reread it maybe 5-10 years ago. And I read the book with a different perspective, being a kid and then being an adult. As an adult, anyone's read The Shining or familiar with the story? Okay, so Jack Torrance is the dad, and he's this tortured writer, and they go to the Overlook Hotel, and the Overlook Hotel basically takes over his soul, and it's a terrific book. But as an adult, when I read the book, I had a lot more empathy for the character Jack Torrance, because I saw his torture. So that was different for me, and as a parent, and him trying to be a good parent, and also being an alcoholic and dealing with wanting to be a successful writer. So I love his books because his stories have always stayed with me. Like, I read a ton of mysteries. I love Robert Crace, Linwood Barclay, Michael Connelly, John Sanford, and I know anyone raise your hands if you like any of those books. I love all of those authors. I think they're absolutely terrific. But the thing with, and when I find an author I like, I get obsessed. I will read every single book they've ever written. And I might not remember them all. They might have to jog my memory if it was a book I read 3 years ago because I read so much. I'm like, oh yeah, that was a really good book. But with Stephen King books, the stories are indelible. The characters are indelible. No matter how many years ago I read them, I remember the characters and I remember the stories. So he's been a great influence for me. And I think the other thing too, I always think about, you might not write someone's backstory, but you know every inch of their DNA. And he's so great at that. Even the small characters in his books are so odd and memorable. So even if you have a more supporting character, that they're memorable characters as well. And that was certainly an influence for me as a writer.
Suzanne, we're going to jump back a few years to the 40s, where Glamorous Dead takes place. Now, the back cover intro on your book really sucked me in. So I started to read. I didn't have time to finish yet, but who's inspired you?
Well, for the 1940s, that would be Barbara Stanwyck. Thank you very much. I started it's my only novel. I can't even say my first, but the first one that's been published. The others have not. But I started that with the idea that Barbara Stanwyck was this kick-ass woman who could go in and be what they called at the time the girl detective. And now we would leave off the girl part, but she would still wear these fabulous heels. And so she goes in and she solves a crime, and in doing so, she leaves herself in a wake. And if you see any of her movies, you'll see that she does that no matter if she's a detective or anything else. And so I started with that idea of, if my mom, because I wasn't alive then, but if my mom were on the set of one of Barbara Stanwyck's movies, what would happen? And then that became the plot, which takes place in the Paramount studio on the set of The Lady Eve with Barbara Stanwyck and Henry Fonda. So it was, kind of a cross between getting to know Barbara Stanwyck and appreciating her, and also getting to know my mom.
That's great. Now, we're going to start back at this and then go that way. What is the biggest challenge you found in your writing, into writing your book?
My biggest challenge is that I don't plot, which is really difficult for a mystery writer, I think. I kind of do it on faith, that every time I sit down, I'm taking this leap of faith that something stronger and that has much more intelligence than I do is going to put a word on the page, and then that word will be followed by another word, and they'll somehow make sense. And so there's this fear buildup before I'll sit myself down, and then eventually that kind of gets worked out and the story takes over. But the hardest part of that process is that getting to sit down and taking that leap of faith that there will be something that will come out, and that something will be worth keeping on the page for the next day and the next day. Yeah.
So I'm sorry,
Suzanne,
the question is the biggest challenge?
What do you find is the biggest, Jane, what do you find as the biggest challenge in writing your book?
I always love to write, and I think I've never had writer's block. I think with journalism, if you have writer's block, you're out the door. See you later, get in the parking lot, your story's due in 5 minutes. I think one of the hardest things, or one of the things I've learned from, and I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts as well, is this is a tough industry. I went the traditional route, getting a literary agent and then a publisher, and there's a lot of rejection. So I thought, man, I've had to, interview killers. There's always, when you're covering the crime beat, someone's always angry at you. Someone's always calling you on the phone and telling you did something wrong or they didn't like what you wrote. So I'm like, I'm tough, I can do this. So I remember I finished my manuscript and I was trying to get a literary agent, and I sent out, I didn't know what I was doing. I had a terrible query letter. You send out this one-page pitch, and it's all these great points about your story, and you gotta hook the agent, because you can't really get it. Most traditional publishers will only look at manuscripts if you have a literary agent representing you. And my query was terrible. And I remember this one agent she was so kind, and she gave me some thoughts, like, I have no interest in reading your story. However, let me give you some thoughts on your query letter. So I appreciated so much all the people, all the agents, all the publishers who gave me feedback. I think it took me about 6 months to get an agent who's lovely. She's still my agent 5 years later. And I thought, okay, got my literary agent, fantastic, where's the book deal? We were on submission for a year and a half. I had to go in and, with my first book, the last time she saw him, I had to go back and make a lot of revisions, and we'd wait based on editors' feedback, constructive feedback, and then I would, it was like, oh, should I just give up? This is crazy. But I finally got a book deal, and I wound up getting a subsequent 2-book deal with my publisher after that. So it was a really a growing experience of you're going to get a lot of rejection. We all get a lot of rejection in life. It's what you're going to do with it. If it's constructive, can you look back at yourself and whatever you're trying to do and say, okay, well, maybe I can make this better. So that's what I did, and I think being open to that was very helpful. But it was very difficult. And then, I don't know if you read your reviews on Amazon or Goodreads or professional reviews like Kirkus or Publishers Weekly, and sometimes those can be painful. I read my professional reviews, but sometimes not reader reviews. But
Thank you.
That was
Thank
something
you.
good to learn.
Janet, besides me, what is your biggest challenge in writing?
My co-writer and husband. As far as writing is concerned, my biggest challenge, because I write only murder mysteries, is finding interesting body dumps. All the series we're writing right now they always start in LA and then they go to different areas. And for the book that just came out, A Slick Deal, takes place in 1956, Catalina. So we spent 3 days in Catalina looking for body dumps that would have been there in 1956. Well, things changed, so we had to ask people, where would you dump a dead body? So some of them would stare at me and walk backwards, But the other half gave me cross streets, they gave me landmarks, like they've thought about it. I mean, it was like, oh, you should look here. Like they've thought about this before.
That's
So
scary.
we spent an hour and a half in pouring rain, freezing cold in January, looking for the body dumps. We had 15 body dumps. We found 5 great ones. I would never have thought to look. So our big challenge is, again, 1956, trying to find what was there. We also spent 2 full days at the library. They have stuff from 1912 in the Catalina library there, so that was fascinating. We looked through newspapers with white gloves. It was really a very interesting 2 days. As far as writing, I think what she's saying about rejections, this is the way it is. And the way I used to think about it, okay, I've got 5 rejections, I'm getting closer to someone saying yes. That's the only way I could handle it. And I got rejections. We had a file, we finally threw it away, of rejections. We started in 2001 writing, and we didn't start publishing until 2011. And out of frustration, we decided to go self-published. And so all of our books are self-published. Any questions, ask me. We've made many mistakes. So, but again, regarding rejections, you just got to pull up your pant legs and just keep going, especially if you know what you're writing is good. Okay, that's my best advice, is just keep going, keep doing, keep writing, don't stop. I have 7 manuscripts I don't want to throw away, but they're under the bed. Things that nobody liked, like all the stuff that wasn't funny. So just keep going and keep writing.
Thank you. Now, Jeri, outside of everyone being dead in the Crispin Guest books, I mean, that period of time, there's nobody around to talk to. And your newest book is contemporary, correct? I mean, it takes place present day.
Right.
But as far as writing your books, whichever time period they take place, what's the biggest challenge that you find for you?
Well, because I'm writing 2 and sometimes 3 series a year, my biggest challenge is finding the time to write it all. Being a reporter at one time, it does help you, and I recommend this to anyone who wants to write novels. Do some writing for your local papers if you can, because seriously, you have to make deadlines, you have to write a certain word count, and it has to be good, and it has to be researched. So it really helps you learn to cut to the chase and get the story told. Because if you're writing a feature, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's got to be interesting for people to bother reading it. So it was good. It was good training. Also, speaking of rejections, have I got them? Yeah, it took me 14 years to get published. Traditionally, I was writing historical novels, and nothing was happening really until I decided to switch to mysteries, and then suddenly the doors opened. But it's a challenge to keep your concentration level, and that's why I'm so anxious to write different series in one time, because I'm striking while the iron's hot. It took so long to get there, and now here I am. So I've got to get those series out. And I've never had banjos accompanying what I said before. I feel like I should be riding the rails talking about this, Jane. But yeah, a lot of the challenges that we've all come across. Agents, I'm on my fourth agent. He's the one that got me published, so I guess I'm going to stick with him. But any advice to those who want to write, and you should have an agent, because an agent can do lots of things for you, is, this is a business partner. Make sure that, you don't have to invite them over for Thanksgiving. They don't have to be your best pal. But you do want to make sure that they know the business and they know the ins and outs and how it has changed since the first time I was published to now. Make sure that they are up with the newest things that are going on, so that you need that business association with your agent. Publishers come and go. We've just heard about a major publishing house, a mid-size publishing house, which has gotten rid of their mystery line and had left a whole lot of mystery authors that I know out in a lurch. So you got to be with it. I think for a lot of us, we have become hybrid authors. We are published by traditional publishers, but also sometimes we self-publish. It's the only way to keep your name out there. It's the only way to keep getting a little bit of income coming through. It's all challenging, which is why I have weaponry. So.
Thanks, Jeri. One question I'm sure. Oh, Janet.
Just one more thing I have to say is that to make anything happen for you, any goal you have, is you have to dream. You have to dream about what it's going to be like to be a writer, what's it going to be like to be an author, what's it going to be like to be a reporter. But I think the first thing is you have to dream. Without that dream, there's no goal. And so that's what I did. We did together. We dreamt what it'd be like sitting at home in our slippers writing. Well, it didn't turn out that way. We're on the road more than we are at home. But I think all challenges, you have to dream first, and then you can meet the challenge.
Thank you, Janet. I'm sure one question that the group here is probably wondering is, where do you find the time? Do you write every day? Do you have a certain schedule? Let's start at this end.
No.
I mean, people have jobs, they have kids, they got all,
I have a day job, and I find myself, I tend to be kind of reclusive. So I'm a teacher, and so it takes a lot of energy at my job. And when I get home, I just want to kind of not do anything. And so I have to wait for summers, and or between semesters. And that's simply the way it is until I can afford to retire, which may never be because I'm a teacher. So, but yeah, it's tough.
Jane?
Funny time to write. I want you to picture my desk. Here's my house. My desk is it's not even in a room. It's right next to the pantry where my two kids are going in for snacks. My husband, on the days he's working from home, sits in this little breakfast table behind me eating the loudest, crunchiest things. And I'm trying to write. He can make cereal and oatmeal sound crunchy. I mean, it's just like, do you really have to be that loud right now? So I am lucky. I work from home. I'm an editor, my day job. I edit for WebMD. But I'm very regimented. I think as a reporter, you get in the zone. It doesn't matter if there's banjos playing. It doesn't matter what's happening. Your husband's crunching something loud behind you when you're trying to write. You just get in the zone, you zone everything out. As a reporter, I had the scanner above my desk. So, and I got my mind into, okay, that sounds important, and if it didn't, I would just zone it out. But I write every day. I take my kids to school, I come home, I do my regular work, and then I do my writing. I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive husband. He's always given me time to write, even before I got my first book published. And I dedicated my second book to him. And in the dedication, it was, he always gave me time to write and never said it was time wasted. So on the weekends, he would take our kids and I would write. And that was just so kind of him, because we didn't know if I would get published or not, but he did it out of love. So that was something I really appreciated. So if you're a writer, it's great to have a supportive spouse to help you out.
I have a supportive spouse as well. He's standing right over there, and I support him. We write between 6 and 8 every day, Monday through Sunday, and sometimes we can go beyond 8. But I think for us, creative juices happen. We're both swimmers. We swim 3 to 4 times a week, and that gives us a break of writing. We're both retired. I'm a retired speech pathologist. I worked in hospitals, and he's a retired graphic designer. He worked for Long Beach City College, is the information. And when we retired, we decided to have our dream come true, and that was to work together. And it's been really nice doing that. The big challenge is being sure that you're writing 6 to 8 in the morning for us. Sometimes it's just editing, and it took a long time for me to realize that editing is writing. It's the same thing. You're just not creating the words, you're fixing the words. So we have a specific time that we write, and as a result, we've published 14 books since 2011. So we're very strict with that. Barring death or fever, we're working 6 to 8 in the morning.
Was that AM?
AM.
You are dedicated.
Very much,
Jeri?
yeah.
And Jeri, how many books a year do you do?
2 to 3, and 3 is my limit. I did 4 one year.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Well, I don't sleep. But I was lucky enough, or I guess prematurely, I quit my job 8 years ago to write full time because I have the long-suffering husband who's very supportive, and he is dedicated in every one of my damn books because he allowed me the time to do that. And if I weren't writing full time, I obviously couldn't have done more than basically 1 book a year. But with that time, I can do 2 to 3 books in different series, and some short stories and articles and all these other things, because it's you just have to keep at it. And I do write every day, holidays, weekends. Yes, thank you. And it's a chore, but yeah, you get the rewards. You get banjo music. Writing is more of a slight addiction than it is most other kinds of art forms, I think. I like to keep at it, and I don't like a day to go by not writing. So I'm always doing something, and I even have by my bedside a pad of paper and a pen that lights, so that when I get an idea, because you'd think I'd learned this by now, but you go to bed, but you got something going on in your head. You think, oh, I'll remember it in the morning. And all I remember in the morning is I had this idea that I didn't write down and I don't remember it. So it may look odd in the morning when I try to read that, but at least I wrote it down and I can remember it. So, I write every day. And, it's changed. It's fluctuated my time. I used to start at 9 o'clock and write all the way through to 5, But that just, the older you get, your attention span just fluctuates, and you gotta go get a fan and, cool yourself up. So I start roughly at 9 and then, toddle around and do different things. Because, you need to be a little bit more inspired sometimes. So sometimes you read something, sometimes you watch something, listen to some kind of music, and then and then you can be inspired again for your second wind the rest of the day. And sometimes it only happens for me at 6 that night, and that's when I start writing. But a lot of my writing is rewriting, as I rewrite everything that I wrote the day. I read everything I wrote the day before to get into the story, and then sometimes you're just revising the whole thing. So
Yes, I read that.
process.
Writing is easy. It's the rewriting and the editing.
I like the
That's the
rewriting
hard
and
part.
editing
But-
now. It used to be the other way around, that I
that's
just
the work.
love the creation stage, and now the creation stage is, ugh. So
Yeah, I myself have been retired 6 years, but I found that I really got more writing done when I was working full-time, because I'd take my laptop with me to work, and so I'd be doing my regular work over here, and then here's my laptop over here. So whenever I was on hold, I'd be doing that over there, working. But we try to keep a schedule as best we can. Now, Jeri kind of alluded to it. I'm going to ask Janet, and the title of this is called Whodunnit, Mystery Novelists Confess. So what's your biggest secret thrill you get while you're writing?
Say again?
To Janet,
What did you say? Was
your
there-
big secret thrill you get from writing.
The secret thrill I get from writing? I thought you were going to ask me if I wore underwear when I write.
Well,
True confessions
if it
here?
works for you.
Well, I think for me, the biggest thrill in writing is killing people. I enjoy that tremendously. I love researching poisons and all this stuff, and I think, and people, my friends joke if the home security ever looked in my, in my computer, because I got all this stuff about how to stab someone and making a noose and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it's just the research. I love getting in there and researching things that I think I'll poison the next person. And I got this really cool book in the mail about poisons. I can't wait. I got it this morning. I can't wait to open it when I get home. So for me, it's the act of research, and it's the act of how to do it, how to kill someone.
don't eat the soup, Will.
I
Before
didn't
I-
bring the grapes. No.
Before I get to Jane, what Jeri said, even in my art classes, design student, I had instructors that said, keep a pen and pencil by your bed, because if you get an idea, if you don't write it down right away, it goes away, and it doesn't come back. So that's always a good thing to do. Jane, what's your secret thrill?
My guilty secret thrill. You might think I'm all sickos, or I'm a sicko, but I like writing from the bad guy's perspective. I find it fascinating. As a reporter, you always look at someone's motive. And it wouldn't matter if, someone is living in a trailer park or they're living in $1 million mansion. There's a reason that they do things. Maybe it's mental illness, maybe it's jealousy, maybe it's greed, maybe they're addicted. So I always find it fascinating, like the mechanics of why people do certain things. I have a new book coming out at the end of March called You Fit the Pattern. I hate the title. My editor picked it. It's the 4th book in the series, and it's a serial killer. I used to live in Louisiana, so I'm going back to some Bayou roots, and he dabbles in voodoo. So that was really fascinating. Anyone been to New Orleans? Okay. Anyone gone to the Voodoo Museum? Okay, that's pretty cool. So it was really fun to do some research again about voodoo and digging into this guy and what makes him tick and why is he so crazy. And I find those scenes with him, and I write from his perspective in some of the chapters I love, which might make me nuts, but there I've said it.
I wrote one book, West of the Pier. It included voodoo. I did a lot of research on that. 1950s voodoo. It is fascinating. If you ever have the opportunity, research voodoo 1950s, and it's a fascinating concept.
It's Suzanne.
My secret thrill also has to do with research, and it is looking through the historical Los Angeles Times. And which you can get, they're piecemeal, they're kind of cut out in little bits and pieces. And then, when you shout out to the library databases, that when you start looking at these, you're pulling up things that you never would have known. You put in a search term, and then all of a sudden you get all of these articles within a certain frame, and you can research from a distance what was going on in a certain place, and you can narrow down to what was going on in a community during a certain period of time. And that, it really is a thrill. I've found out all kinds of little tidbits that I can use.
Yeah, for me too. Secret thrill is the stuff that I learned. You can't use it all in your books, but the stuff you learn researching. Our book called Desert Ice took place in 1950s Las Vegas. The things we learned about Las Vegas in 1950s, we had no idea that, number one, discrimination was such a problem in Las Vegas. You'd think of all the places in the United States, it wouldn't be in Las Vegas, but it was. And while we were there, we visited the Mob Museum, which is up near Fremont Street. And we went in and we said, oh, we'll spend 20, 30 minutes. And we were there 4.5 hours. In fact, we talked to we also spent a lot of time at UNLV at the special collections. And someone told us one time there, they said that the 50s was a time when they called it the good old, bad old days. They said when the mob was running things, sort of. But it was a lot of fun. Janet got to interview a mobster's daughter. She says they were pretty much normal people because these guys were criminals in other parts of the United States. They came to Las Vegas, and pretty much everything was legal except murder. And they'd go to shop at Sears. The kids would go to school. They belonged to the PTA. These guys would build hospitals and things like that. Who knew? There were so many things we learned about Las Vegas, like that the poor part of the town was called West Las Vegas, and pretty much that's gone. The city kind of bulldozed it, kind of erased that part of history, and put the freeway through there. But the things we learned when we're researching our different stories are amazing to us. We've got some time for questions and answers. If anyone's got some questions, go ahead and address it here.
Do you make an outline of your book, or do you just wing it as you go along?
She asked if you outline or if you kind of just wing it as you go along. We'll start at Jeri's end.
I used to outline, and that was very successful. And then one day, I just couldn't outline anymore. And so now I was back to writing by the seat of my pants. And I always have a general idea of what the book's going to be about. That would be terrible to sit down and wonder that. But so, excuse me. So yeah, I don't outline anymore. I just live it.
I do extensive outlining. My outlines are 3 or 4 pages. Remember, I've got lots of red herrings, lots of clues, lots of people lying. And if I don't have everything set up, I get lost, or I'll forget about somebody, or I'll make the wrong red herring the real clue. So for me, I do very in-depth outlines.
As for me, I'd rather have a root canal than write an outline, but I have no choice. My agent and my editor require them, and I hate it when I'm doing it. It seems so dry and painful, but once they're done, it's a fantastic roadmap for me. So I hate the process, and it's terrible. Recently, I wrote a standalone book that's not part of my series. I sent it to my agent. I find a long outline is a piece of cake compared to writing a 2-pager. My agent asked me for a 2-page outline, and I was like, oh dear God. So that's tough. So I don't like to write outlines, but they wind up helping me they're a roadmap to me as I'm writing my story.
No.
No.
But in the manuscript I just finished, I actually didn't have an outline, but I had to stick to an outline because when it gets sold, the new book will be a retelling of Gangster Island. It's called Gangster Island. It's a retelling of Treasure Island, except I set it in 1934 Los Angeles. And instead of pirates, there are gangsters. And so I had certain plot elements that I had to keep from the original. And I had to hit those marks all the way through, which was very difficult for me because I wanted to go this way, and I had to kind of rein it in. So anyway, it was the outline that I had to stick to, and now I am happily writing again with no outline.
Yeah, when we talk outlines, I'm like Suzanne. I've always been sort of a write myself into a corner person without an outline. They like us, but as you do, when you think about outlining, it's not like the outlining you did in high school. The outlines that you do when you're writing are like a roadmap for yourself. As many of our writers here have said, it helps you keep from getting lost, helps you keep track of everyone, and I'm sure that all of our authors do some extensive background checks on all their characters as
Could
well.
I add one thing?
Sure.
On my second book in the series, I had submitted the outline to my editor, and the story started taking me in another direction. So instead of sticking with the outline, I was like, I'm sorry that this is going a different way. So the bad guy became someone else. So I think stories are living, breathing things, and if you're lucky enough, one will present itself to you, and you need to follow it. So in that case, I deviated from the original outline I came up with, and my editor wound up agreeing. So sometimes you just have to follow the story as it presents itself to you.
And sometimes, when you pick up a book here at the library and you read that back cover, that's one of the hardest things for the authors to write sometimes, is that back cover part, to try and digest the story without giving it away on the back cover of the book.
Thankfully, publishers do that a lot
They
for
do that
you.
But sometimes I want to see a synopsis, and a lot of times authors are asked to have with them in their mind what's called an elevator talk. So if you're on an elevator, which has happened to me, I got on the elevator one time up in LA, and who should step on the elevator with me was Ray Bradbury. I wasn't writing at the time, but he told me about one of the things he was working on in like 30 seconds before he got off. And that's something they've asked us to do. So somebody could say, oh, so what's your book about? And you can tell them. Some of us are better at it than others. Any more questions? Yes.
When you mentioned query letters, when you were first starting out, how many did you have to write? Did you say, I'm going to do 5 at a time, 6 at a time, 15?
Once I perfected the query letter, one thing I learned is to send your query letter out. If you are trying to get an agent, send 12 out at a time. See if you're lucky enough to get feedback. Hopefully you'll get someone saying, hey, I'd love to read either a partial of your manuscript or the whole thing. But I made this mistake when I wrote that bad query letter I told you about. I think I sent it to 60 agents. Some, I either got like dear author or I did, radio silence. So do it in batches, send 12, see what kind of feedback you get. I don't know if you're trying to write. There's a couple, anyone writing books right now trying to get an agent, there's a couple sources that I use that were fantastic. One was Query Shark by an agent, Janet Reed. You submit her query and she'll give you feedback, or you can look at other query letters, and that was really terrific. Query Tracker was another source that I used. It would help me find out which agents represented which genres, which ones were closed to certain queries at different times. So that was really helpful. But yeah, the biggest thing was just send them out in slow batches. Agents are busy. Hopefully, if they give you some feedback, you can improve your query.
And I'm sorry, I was just saying, I hate to say this, but in my day, when I was doing that, it was mailed, snail mail. So you had to wait quite a long time because the mail had to reach them. They had to maybe read it or cry over it or tear it up. And then they had to send back their feedback. So, there was a lot of time. So after you send 2 or 3, you realize, that query letter is crap. So I became the query letter queen. I learned how to really smooth it, shave it down to just the point of the shining. And then I would send out 10, 15 at a time, because in those days, you had to print out the first chapter of your book if that's what they wanted. You had to stick it in an envelope and mail it. So there was a lot of that going on. Now this Query Tracker is an online system.
Some of them don't even want mail anymore. They want it all.
No, that's got to be email. You have to. The biggest thing is looking to what the agent wants to get from you.
A funny thing, I took a query letter workshop one time, and I'd been writing my first book, my romantic comedy. 2 things I learned. The first, when I was doing my romantic comedy, I was sending it out, getting nothing under my name, Will Zeilinger. So I used a pseudonym and sent it out a few times under Victoria Becker, a woman's name, and I got a lot of interest. They didn't want to hear from a guy's point of view. And that's what some of the agents said, was that we love your story, we just don't know how to sell it, because they're mostly written from the female point of view. But this one book I wrote, I sent out the query letters and the outline and the synopsis, and I hadn't written the book. And after I took this workshop, all of a sudden I got 3 agents that wanted to see the manuscript finished. And I turned to Janet and I said, I got to write the book. I had the outline. Thankfully, I had an outline and I had the synopsis for it, but the book wasn't written. And so every day for how many hours a day? About 8 or 12 hours a day.
He would write, and I would take it the next day to work and edit it while he was writing the next chapter. It was horrible. But we got it done in 30 days.
If
Two of
anybody's
us
here
working
ever done
on it.
NaNoWriMo,
Yeah.
that write a novel in a month thing, it was like that on steroids. Any more questions?
Do you ever put hours and hours into writing something and then it just doesn't come together or it's not?
Definitely.
She says-
even though I do tight
Let me repeat
outlines.
the question first. See, they want to know if you put hours and hours into something that just doesn't come together. Go ahead.
Definitely. I can't tell you how many hundreds of words I've had to delete because it didn't work for the book. See, the main purpose of a book is to write a good book. If something doesn't fit, you have to get rid of it. That doesn't mean you throw it away. You save it for another book sometime. But after putting blood and tears into pages and having to throw it out, it's difficult. And especially when I have to tell him what he wrote doesn't work, or he tells me, honey, this is not working, and I spent hours on this. So the big thing is yes, and you have to understand that that's the way it goes.
Any other comments from up here, the panel? Otherwise, we're running a little short on time. I was wondering if each one of you, we're going to be out signing books and selling them if you'd like copies. Would everyone like to do a quick blurb about your latest book that you'll have out there?
Well, the Crispin Guest medieval mystery there, The Deepest Grave. Crispin Guest, like I said, is a former knight who is now a detective, who's called the Tracker, my medieval detective. And he is hired by a priest who's worried that there might be, he thinks, that the dead are walking. So Crispin goes to investigate this with much eye-rolling. And the series, there's always some sort of religious relic involved or venerated object, and this is no different. It also has a religious relic within. And the second book, I also have the first book in this series, Book of the Hidden, and the second book, Deadly Rising, for sale. And it continues the story of Kylie Strange, who is trying to put back all these monsters that come out of this book. And with the help or the hindrance of the guardian of the book, a demon, a very sexy demon, who's on the cover of this one. So that's a good Halloween story for you.
Slick Deals came out in April, and it focuses on the murder, which takes place at the Roosevelt Hotel in L.A. And then we had to go look at that to see how we could get him to be, how we can kill him. Anyway, and then we had another dead body, so we put it somewhere else in the hotel. But from there, the clues lead to Catalina in 1956, and they get over there. Now, Skylar Drake is a PI. He's also a stuntman. So when he doesn't have enough money from his PI, he becomes a stuntman. And this is one gorgeous-looking guy here. He's like an 11. He has a quirk where what happened is that he was working for the LAPD, and his wife, the love of his life, and his little 3-year-old girl was killed in a house fire. And he blamed the LAPD, and that's how he got off LAPD, started suing them. He needed money, so he became a stuntman. So it's been 3 years. He's now thinking, well, maybe I should start dating, but he's got this thing where he can't date ladies whose first names end in Y because they're bad luck. So since I like to torture my characters, all the femme fatales' first names end in Y, and he has to bite his tongue and walk away. So anyway, he has a lot of lovely ladies in Catalina whose first names end in Y, and the story also focuses on the oil conspiracy in Long Beach in 1956. It was huge. And that's what we got from our researching the oil conspiracy was basically in Long Beach. A lot of killing, a lot of fighting. In fact, we went down to the beach and he practiced throwing me, so I knew how to be thrown, and a judo type of thing. And the police came up and asked him if he was okay because I was throwing him, so I would learn how to do that. So it's a very real, it's a real interesting story, fast paced. All our books are very fast paced. Lots of interesting characters and femme fatales that first names end in Y.
I'll tell you about what's coming up. I want to tell you just briefly about my series. I write the Julia Gooden Mystery Series from Kensington Publishing. Julia Gooden is a crime reporter in the city of Detroit. In the first book, the last time she saw him, her brother is abducted when she's a child, when she's 7 years old. It's a cold case. She has tremendous survivor's guilt because she was in the room when her brother was kidnapped, but she was sleeping and can't remember what happened to him. On the 30th anniversary of her brother's disappearance, her youngest son is kidnapped, leaving her just 24 hours to figure out sudden reminders of her brothers are clues leading to her son's abductor or merely coincidence. I remember when I first turned my manuscript into my editor for that book, my editor said, "I can't wait to see how your character grows and develops." And I remember thinking, oh my God, my character has to grow and develop? So the third book in the series that came out in hardcover in March is coming out in paperback and audiobook this coming March, called Worth Killing For. Again, hate that title. My editor picked it. I like to throw whammies into my characters' lives. My character, Julia, she's kind of finally gotten it together. She's very overprotective of her children because of what happened to her brother. But you find her in this book feeling, kind of calm, peaceful in life. Things are good. She's not crazy protective of her children anymore. And her father comes back. He abandoned her when she was a little girl. So I wanted to see how she would react. She's kind of gotten her life together, and now her past comes back. But she has to join forces with her father to determine whether a stranger vowing he's the brother she lost is who he claims to be, or if it's a trap to ensure the many sins of her con artist dad are paid in full this time. And finally, I have You Fit the Pattern is coming out in April. It's the fourth in the series. It's got the voodoo twist. I like the cover. I don't like the title, but the cover's kind of cool. Thank you.
The Glamorous Dead is set in 1940 in Hollywood, and it is a time of right before huge change in Los Angeles. So they're right on the cusp of World War II, also on a huge expansion in Los Angeles in terms of the downturn of the orange industry and an explosion in housing. And my protagonist lives right next door to the Knots, who are starting to build a ghost town because the lines are so long waiting to get to Mrs. Knott's chicken dinner. And so my protagonist ends up going to Los Angeles, and she and her best friends get a job on the set of The Lady Eve, as I mentioned. But her best friend ends up dead, and my protagonist is the main suspect. And so in order to prove her innocent, Barbara Stanwyck kind of pushes her into being a detective. And so she and Barbara Stanwyck seek to solve the crime together.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Julie, I think that's all we have for now. We'd like to appreciate everything we're doing. Everything Janet said, same goes for me.